What we do here is go back.
Hello and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 18, States and Societies of Sub-Saharan Africa. First up, agriculture and herding spread gradually throughout Sub-Saharan Africa from about 2000 BCE until the end of the first millennium CE through a process known as the Bantu migrations. After about 500 BCE, the knowledge of iron metallurgy also was disseminating throughout Africa. As a result of these movements, of the introduction of new nutritious foods such as bananas, and of long-distance trade, the population of Africa grew dramatically, and increasingly complex forms of government began to emerge. Most sub-Saharan African cultures were kin-based and organized into relatively small villages that were loosely applied into districts governed by a chief. Occasionally larger and more structured kingdoms and empires appeared. These larger states generally consolidated their position through controlling long-distance trade in their regions. In general, the history of sub-Saharan Africa from 1000 to 1500 CE is noted for the following. Number 1, the introduction and widespread dissemination of the Islamic religion. In many cases, the belief in Islam supplemented rather than supplanted traditional religious practices. In sub-Saharan societies became important centers of worship and learning in the Islamic world. A regular and reliable flow of trade goods, gold, ivory, and slaves being the most important exports. These trade networks were both overland, particularly notable was the Trans-Saharan camel caravan routes, and maritime, where East African city-states became important stops in the Indian Ocean seaways. And finally, the emergence and growth of states that became highly influential in the cross-cultural interactions of this period. The states of Congo, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Mali, and the Swahili city-states became trade and religious centers whose fortunes were clearly tied into those of Eurasia. So we're first going to talk about some big ideas. Number 1 is trade. This chapter kind of highlights some things that historians have been talking about for a little bit that we didn't really understand a ton about the history of Africa during this period for a very long time. Many Europeans, as they were writing their history, wanted to almost whitewash, if it were, the history of Africa by saying that most of Africa could not have created its own culture or its own history without the help of Europeans. And this has kind of changed over the last number of years because historians have been able to unearth pre-European interaction with African cultures and are now starting to see more and more African-centered or African-started ideas, trade networks, and processes that we weren't aware of before. And so one of the big things, again, is gold, ivory, and slaves. Agriculture and iron production is huge. And it's more interconnected in the world than we previously thought. Before we thought Africa was doing its own thing. And in a number of years recently, we've kind of noticed that Africa probably was interacting with Europe and Asia more readily than we previously thought. Kin groups are big, and Islam is a big part of Africa during this period. So the effects of the early African migration. Bantu-speaking people settle south of the equator around 1000 CE. These are some of the people that kind of are, we don't have a ton of information about them, but we do know that they settled probably south of the equator. They started with agriculture, start of civilizations, herding spreads within the Bantu migrations, and they practice iron metallurgy. They get axes, hoes, and ades. Ades is this like weird kind of tonged kind of thing that you use to dig in the ground. It's kind of like a hoe, but it looks more like a spiky kind of thing. Cultivation of bananas, domestication in Southeast Asia. So we know that in Africa there was a big shift in our understanding when we started to figure out the cultivation of bananas as it traveled from Southeast Asia to Africa. Originally, Malay soldiers or Indonesian sailors colonized Madagascar, the small island to the southeast of the continent of Africa, around 300 to 500 CE. They introduced bananas, yams, and chickens. Couple things. Number 1, chickens are a really good source of protein. They don't require a lot of food. Most chickens scavenge their own food. They can eat like leftover grains. They eat bugs from the ground. They can be grown relatively quickly. They also provide other sources of protein in the form of eggs, and you can get a lot of them going very easily for a supplement to your diet. Yams. Yams are very calorie rich, and they grow underground. They can be stored just like potatoes could in North America, and in similar ways they provide a lot of calories and a lot of nutrition. And finally, bananas. Bananas are specifically very important because of their introduction of the ability to grow abundantly well outside of its original habitat. One of the things about the way we study history is looking at how trade affects the goods and the people, but also how does the supplanting or changing of where those original goods started affect the regions that those items move to. A perfect example of this that many of you would understand is cocaine. Cocaine as a drug is originally in the coca leaf, and many of the villagers around the areas where cocaine comes from and is naturally grown used the coca leaves as kind of like a chewing kind of tobacco kind of thing. They would grind up some of the leaves, stuff it in their cheeks, and just kind of chew on that leaf all day. But as people started to experiment with chemistry and they start to learn more and more about synthesizing and purifying the raw, good and drug that's inside of that leaf, people made it into a powder form, and then the introduction of pure cocaine into the Americas and into the world at large now has created a drug problem for many people and drug epidemics around the world. Well, bananas are kind of like that in the sense that in Indonesia, bananas grow fairly well, but they grow exceptionally well in Africa, where they're well adapted to the African climate. It's hot. They also can grow very quickly. Bananas basically are their own little seed pods. You can take a banana, throw it in the ground, let it be buried for a while, water it, a banana tree will pop up. The heat, the humidity from Africa itself will allow the banana tree to grow quickly. It grows lots of bananas on bushels. Those bushels can be used to feed people, and this supplements their caloric intake. And food supply increases with this key crop. And like we've talked about before, when calorie counts increase, so does population growth. Around 400 BCE, we see we only have about 2 to 3 million peoples within Africa. And about the year 0, we're right about approaching 11 million. But after the introduction of the crop of bananas around 800 CE, we're at 17. And by 1000 CE, the time we're talking about, we're at 22 million people living within the area of Africa. Kin-based society, stateless, segmented societies. They didn't believe in having a large formed government. It was segmented, meaning that there were sectioned off areas, even though people were living close by. There were no elaborate hierarchies or bureaucracies. The average population of a village was only about 100. It was ruled by elders, or the oldest people living within that group. These network of villages resolved disputes in an ad hoc manner. Ad hoc just means kind of going by the situation. Ad hoc sometimes means that the dispute would be solved in a traditional fashion. Sometimes a dispute would be solved in an irrational fashion. Sometimes a dispute would be not really get resolved. So it just depends on how the people at the time wanted to deal with the situation. This reminds me a lot of what we talked about with the Mongols, and this kind of brings us back to the point of comparing and contrasting societies. The Traditions and Encounters textbook does a really good job of matching up chapters of peoples that kind of have similar structures to their society, similar outcomes, and similar outlooks on their world. And as we look at what their kin-based society it looks like in Africa, we can compare this to the Eurasian, Central Asian plains that we talked about in the last chapter. The higher government authorities were rare during this time, leading back to this whole kin-based society. Chiefdoms. Population pressures, the growth of people after 1000 CE, increased competition and disputes. People are competing over land. More people means just more conflict in general. Small chiefdoms appear and overrule kin-based groups. As these chiefdoms appear, these kin-based groups kind of break up the traditional family and extended family structures that we had during the time before 1000 CE. These small kingdoms formed during this time based around a chief or a great leader, the kingdom of If and Benin. Here are the kingdoms, empires, and city-states of sub-Saharan Africa from 800 to 1500 CE. You can see in the purple we have the TransSaharan trade routes, which we're going to talk about, the maritime trade routes of Eastern Africa that we're going to talk about. We have the MLA Empire overlapping in areas where the Songhay will spread out. The Kingdom of Ghana in the red. We're going to talk about all those in just a second. So first we have the Kingdom of Congo, the basin of the Congo or Zaire River. It was a conglomeration or gathering together of several village alliances. They participated actively in trade networks, most centralized rule of early Bantu kingdoms. What happened is during this time, these Bantu kingdoms that we talked about that weren't really a well-structured, well-organized kind of group, kind of moved together to kind of organize themselves in a way that found commonalities in terms of trade networks. Their royal currencies were cowries or seashells that they got from the Indian Ocean. Now, if you think about where I'm talking, the Congo River in the village of Zaire, we have on the western coast. So we now know that when we look at these royal currency, that these cowrie seashells come from the Indian Ocean. We know that there was large-scale transcontinental trade networks that were set up early on, even in this Kingdom of Congo. They ruled from the 14th to the 17th century until undermined by Portuguese slave traders, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. The Islamic Kingdom and Empires. Islam spreads to West Africa, originally through trans-Saharan caravans, and coastal East Africa through maritime trade. They have a profound influence after the 8th century. If you think about where a map is situated between where Mecca would be situated, where Muhammad starts his proselytizing and pronouncement of Islam, and then you think about the spread of Islam through its empires, you start to see that there's only a few ways that Islam can spread into Africa. Number one, it can travel through the Islamic sailors that are traveling up and down the coast of East Africa through the maritime trade. And then you can also see that this trans-Saharan caravan, these caravans led by camels, and again, Muhammad was a trader by profession. He was very big into making money through trade. This trans-Saharan caravan is only accessible through the use of camels, which mainly come from the Middle East. Using camels to cross the Sahara Desert that kind of goes across the entirety of North Africa, you can only really make it through that desert with the caravans through the process of using an animal that doesn't take up a lot of water, that can carry a very heavy load. And this is how Islam spread throughout Africa. The Trans-Saharan trade in Islamic states in West Africa. We just talked about how there was a desiccation or a desertification of Sahara, begins around 5000 BCE. And then there's an introduction of Arabian camels, which revolutionizes the trade. It takes only about 70 to 90 days to cross the Sahara. Not terribly long for this time, but it was able to reach a new market for the goods that were coming in to Africa. Arabs established trading communities, specifically in Gao. Next, we have the Kingdom of Ghana. It's not related to the modern state of Ghana, but developed the 4th to 5th century CE, protection against camel-driving raiders. Now, if you were one of the peoples that were trading across the Sahara, you would think of having a good amount of money with you going back and forth. Well, if you were an enterprising thief, you could also raid and wait in the Sahara and just attack the caravans that travel through the Sahara. It becomes apparent to the Kingdom of Ghana that they need to come together to protect themselves against these camel-driving raiders, and it becomes the center of African gold trade. They imported from south to Ghana and also sold ivory, slaves, exchanged horses, cloth, and salt. So most of the gold deposits in Africa really come from the south. If you're one of the traders that is looking to find gold, you're going to have to travel very far across pretty much the whole of Africa. Well, the people of Ghana figure out that their main way of making money would be to get the gold from the south to the Kingdom of Ghana, and then once the camel traders come, you can trade them the African gold for their goods. They also sold ivory, which is made of the bones or the tusks of like rhinos and elephants. It's highly prized as a good for making different kind of like handles for knives and boxes. It's just a very fancy kind of good. Today, ivory trade is a very big problem in those places because of the need to kill some of the world's most endangered species, specifically rhinoceros and elephants. Slaves also are traded. The people of Ghana were not the first people to be trading slaves. This goes back to even far to the Greeks and the Romans that we talked about. They had slaves. And so the use, however, of slaves being sold for the purpose of commerce is a very new introduction to Africa during this time. People had used slaves before this in terms of war, as we had seen with other cultures. You attack a village or a town or a group of people. You don't kill all the people. They then become your slaves. But then the Kingdom of Ghana starts to sell slaves during this time. They did exchange horses, which is, again, a very profitable part of the caravan. They're able to move lots of goods. They move quickly for warfare as well. Cloth is another thing, and salt. Salt is a highly prized good and commodity for preserving meat, for flavoring food. Our bodies naturally need salt to function, and salt becomes one of the things that's traded in the Kingdom of Ghana. Next, we get Kombosale, the capital of the Kingdom of Ghana, principal trading center. High point is in the 9th to 12th century. Population about 15,000 to 20,000, much larger than those original villages we talked about before. And it was a military and cultural center. So here is a map of Africa. And then here is the area we're talking about. And then here is Kombisale, right there where that red box just fell. So just to kind of give you an understanding, if you look at these lines, you can see some of the trade network routes that kind of crisscrossed across the Sahara. And Kombisale becomes one of the main military and cultural centers for the Kingdom of Ghana. Islam in West Africa. Kings of Ghana convert in the 10th century. It has a positive impact on trade and relations with North Africa. If you think about it, the more in line you are with the people you're trading, the more likely you are to get a fair deal, the more likely you are to get along and not compete. Also, less fighting, less raiding in general. They synthesize Islam with local traditions, practicing magic and wooden idols in Islam. Muhammad was very much against magic in the sense that you were bending Allah's will and the will of what Allah has set up for the world to your will. And especially with Islam being about submission to what Allah wants, practicing magic almost is an affront to God because you're saying that you know what's best for the world. And so by practicing magic, you are trying to go around the will of Allah. Like, for example, if your kid was sick and you practice magic to try and to divine or get a positive outcome where your kid is no longer sick, you are almost resisting some of the will that Allah has. While we might beg that Allah heals your kid, it is absolutely unacceptable within Islam to try to use magic to create a favorable outcome outside of praying to Allah for deliverance from the illness. Also, they used wooden idols. If you remember back to my stories of Muhammad, he, when taking over Mecca, goes into the Kaaba and he destroys all the idols within the Kaaba. And this is his belief that the destruction of these idols will lead the people to only worship Allah as he is the only true God, and that there should be no graven images of other gods. But within Islam in West Africa, you have people that are not willing to completely give up every little bit of what they were practicing before in religion, and instead are willing to kind of blend together Islam with some of their tribal traditions. In nearby Tekrur, there's aggressive missionaries to Islam. These aggressive missionaries basically were very violence prone to try and convince people to convert to Islam. Sundiata, the Lion Prince, who rules from 1230 to 1255. As the Empire of Mali extends over the Kingdom of Ghana, they do this through the process of cavalry. We talked about this with the Mongols chapter. Quick hits, guerrilla-style warfare, feints. The neighboring kingdoms as well are conquered by Sundiata, the Lion Prince. Took greater advantage of the TransSaharan Trade network. Nominally, he was a Muslim, but didn't force conversion. As a ruler, you have some decisions that you can make. You can choose to make all of your subjects follow your faith to the letter and be very brutal in their practice or non-practice of your faith, or you could be a in this example with Sundiata, a Muslim, but not force the conversion over the people you rule for some practical purposes, mostly to prevent rebellion. If your people feel like their religion is important to them, it can inspire some people within your kingdom that you're ruling to fight back against your rule because you aren't practicing the right version of what the god or gods want you to do. So by not forcing conversions, you're really gaining a lot of favor by the people that you're ruling. Then we get Mansa Musa, who rules from 1312 to 1337. He was the grandnephew of Sundiata. He was a very fervent Muslim. He performed the Hajj in 1324 through 1325. When he returned, he did some gold distribution, spreading out gold to his subjects. Now, this teaches us a couple things. Number one, that the Hajj was able to be completed by somebody from West Africa relatively easily in only about a year or two to get to Mecca and to return as a king in West Africa. So we know that the TransSaharan Trade Network was very efficient. It moved people as well as goods along that TransSaharan network very efficiently. We also know that this gold distribution means that the ruler Mansa Musa has access to large reserves of gold. Gold is a valuable commodity to this community, and that these people can now use it for trade in the larger sphere of these trade networks we've been talking about. He constructed numerous mosques, supported Muslim scholars, and the empire declines soon after his rule. Indian Ocean trade and Islamic states in East Africa. Now we're moving to the east side. East Coast maritime trade was weak until the 2nd century. The Bantu peoples populate the coast. The Swahili, or coasters is what it means in Arabic, engage in trade with the Arabs. The language forms as a kind of mix between Bantu influenced by Arabic. And so you can see that early interactions in the 10th century within the 2nd century increases through their interaction with Arabs and Islam. The trade increases in the 10th century. Swahili city-states. Great wealth. Why? Basically because of the trade networks, the 11th to 12th century CE. There's development of city-states, just like that in Greece, but not based on the models of democracy, but similar in the form that these cities were as large as states, interacted with the world independently, while still being a part of larger networks of trade. Architecture moved from wood/mud to coral and stone. They were able to harvest coral from the ocean, and were building monumental architecture during this time. What we find very interesting is that Chinese silk and porcelain is also imported to the eastern coast of Africa, meaning that the maritime trade routes were also working very efficiently during this time. Here is a Knox sculpture from that time period. You can see it moved away from the clay and mud and more into the stone structure of what we've been talking about. Kilwa was a city-state on the East African coast. It had fishing, some limited trade from 800 to 1000 CE. They then turned to agriculture and increased trade in pottery and stoneware. It then became a major trading center by the 14th century. Kilwa is an example of how agriculture and trade radically transforms an area of the globe, specifically in East Africa, exporting over a ton of gold per year by the 15th century CE. So as this city-state grows and shifts its focus from fishing and limited trade to being one of agriculture and being a trade good in terms of pottery and stoneware, we see that they're able to increase their wealth and value all the way to the 15th century. Then we get to Zimbabwe, which stands for the dwelling of the chief. There's a stone complex called Great Zimbabwe, built in the early 13th century CE, and it was used as its capital. The picture is there in the background. Its population was 18,000 in the late 15th century, and it was one of the largest kingdoms for its time. Managed trade between internal and coastal regions. Very impressive feat for a group of people who many Europeans said could not have done all this work or all these organizing principles for the trade networks and agriculture and monumental architecture as they believed. So for my class, you guys are going to be writing a paper, and it says, who writes history and why is it written as it is? 2-page minimum, type, double space, 12-point font, times New Roman 1-inch margins, typical MLA format. You're going to be watching this video. I'll be showing it in class. You can also find it on YouTube. Ancient Africa, A History Denied. We're going to be watching it. It's 51 minutes. Yeah, go ahead and check in with me, and I'll tell you when that one is due. Islam in East Africa. Ruling elites in East Africa accept Islam without forcing general population to convert. Again, back to that principle of keeping the peace. Often retain pagan religious traditions and practices. Islam serves as the social glue within other merchants and states. It opened doors to alliances and trade. If you're Islamic, or if you're a Muslim, you don't really see any problem in believing in the brotherhood of all peoples under Allah. And this allows this glue of religion to kind of make people see the world in a similar way, allowing people to form alliances based on trust of religion and trade networks. You're trading things that people really want. You're trading goods that you could see people needing. You're not trading goods that are haram or forbidden by Islam, specifically like pork or pigs. And you really are able to observe things like holidays and practices like 5 times a day prayer. And you also understand a lot of the same worldview, and you also sort of speak the same language in Arabic. And so this makes things a lot easier in terms of relationships between traders during this time. Arabian Society and cultural development. Some kingdoms, empires, city-states with well-defined classes. There were ruling elites. There was a merchant class, a peasant class. Sounds a lot like feudalism that we've talked about before. In other areas in sub-Saharan Africa, continue to use traditional kin-based groups. So some groups were this way, some groups are that way, other groups were another way. But yeah, it just depended on which group you were looking at. Similar, again, to some of the problems that we saw when we looked at the Eurasian central plains, that as the Mongols and those groups living there kind of spread out, they adopted different ways of ruling, different ways of organizing their society based on the needs of their people. Kinship groups. Extended families, clans. There was an idea of private property, less prevalent. They didn't really completely have the idea that the land was your land, but they did kind of understand that there was like set aside land for like the king or for the people, but they didn't see it as like you could own the land. The land was held communally, so the land for farming was held for all of the community, and then the harvest was distributed by elders. So these kinship groups were seen as almost a form of proto-communism, proto-socialism. The land was not owned by one person. It was not seen as something that could be taken from one person and given to another person, but they believed that the land was to be used by all people for the good of all people within the community. These harvests being distributed by the elders would be distributed based on the needs of the individuals that came to collect the food. So if you had a family of 4, you would get a certain amount of food, but you would get probably less than the family of 8, for example. And the elders would use their wisdom and judgment to kind of distribute the food as well and as evenly as they could. Sex and gender relations. Men work with specialized skills, tanning like leather and ironwork, and also heavy labor. They guarded their secrets to trade, hereditary. So if you were a tanning or a leather worker, you probably would not have learned it from anyone other than maybe your grandfather, your uncle, or your dad. This is to protect the kind of hold you as a family would have over the secrets of making that good. If there is a lot of people doing the same trade within a small area, the value of that trade goes down. But if you hold on to that secrets of the trade through hereditary succession, you're able to make lots of money because not a lot of people know how to do the thing that you know how to do really well. Both sexes, however, work in agriculture. Male rule is more common, but there were expanded roles for women, merchants, some military activity for them, but there was a lot of honor as life givers. Specifically, women would be praised for bringing about people in their birthing of people. Women are uniquely designed or uniquely suited or uniquely evolved for that purpose. And one of the amazing things that this culture did was they were able to kind of see that without women, they would not have any men. So women almost are like the first step. It kind of comes back to if men are so great, where do they all come from? Women, is it a chicken or egg thing or egg chicken thing? Islamic norms, slow to penetrate African society. Age grades. From early agricultural period in the Sudan, there are peer groups of a single age cohort. A cohort is a group of people that share a similar goal or similar thing that they're trying to do together. It crossed lines of family and kinship, and these peer groups were used for a number of different things. Specifically for the creation and of trade goods, and also for the work in agriculture. They also would be organized for different activities within the community as well. Slavery. Again, slavery is practiced since ancient times, go all the way back to the first 8 chapters of our book. Most slaves were captives of war. Some were debt slaves. So let's say you owed me $20. In this example, you could be my slave for like 3 weeks, and that would pay off your $20 debt. But it usually wouldn't happen for a small amount of money. It was probably thousands or millions of whatever the currency would be worth, and people could sell themselves into slavery to pay off that debt rather than try and pay back through loans or a non-guarantee that I would ever get repaid. They also put into slavery suspected witches. At this time, they didn't really have the religious prohibition from Christianity that talks about not suffering a witch to live and stoning them to death, but they did not really like witches, so what they did is they kind of made them slaves, believing that kind of harnessing their freedom would allow them to be kind of controlled and to protect the community as a whole. And of course, criminals were used as slaves, used principally in agricultural labor, that backbreaking, picking up, harvesting, planting kind of work. And slaves are a form of personal wealth and social status. This starts to kind of pervade Africa during this time. The more slaves you have, meaning the less work you have to do, but you receive the benefits and rewards of having slaves do the work for you. This also provides the growth in wealth, which provides a growth in social status within the community, and the cycle just kind of keeps on going on. Slave trading. Increased Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade stimulates slave trade in the 9th century CE. Africa replaces Eastern Europe as principal source of slaves. Originally, in Eastern Europe was where most of the slaves came from. Think back to some of the kind of barbaric cultures that we talked about under the Romans. This moves down to Africa as just kind of the quantity becomes available as a result of these trans-Saharan trade networks. It creates internal African slave trade. More powerful states or groups of people attack smaller kinship-based groups. At its high point, 10,000 to 20,000 slaves per year during this phase of slave trading. This is before transatlantic slave trade are sold per year. Now, the monetization of slavery is a very big shift in history during this time. Before, like I talked about, we basically had slavery based on a number of social problems that needed to be solved. You owe me money, you need to pay me back, you don't have a good job or a way to pay me back, you have to be my slave. However, slave trade in the 9th century shifts to a value of creating currency or a almost trade market for people. As the demand for labor goes up, using slaves and capturing slaves and trading slaves becomes its own industry. Something in the same way that a iron worker creates some iron good or a tanner creates some leather good, a slave trader now becomes a merchant of slaves and creates a commodity or a good in the form of goods, not a good as in positive, for this culture. And this creates a desire and demand for more and more slaves, which is going to become a very large negative impact as we look at Africa going forward. Here is an Arabian Swahili slave trade. Interestingly enough, this is a photograph, not a painting, of slave trading, meaning that all the way into I want to say that it says 2000 from the copyright, but I'm positive this is not from that time. Uh, Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, we still had slavery in Africa of people being chained together and sold as laborers. To this day, there's still slaves that are sold on black markets around the world, and people are traded like a commodity. The Zanjeer Revolt. This is a slave revolt. Slaves from Swahili coast exported to work in Mesopotamia. Sugarcane plantations. Sugarcane is backbreaking work. It's very tedious. It's very painful. You can die a lot of times. Sugarcane is very weird in that it has very weird leaves that can cut your hand. You have to use a machete and just like labor all day in the hot sun. Also, they were used for scraping out salt deposits. You basically use salt from the ocean, and you scrape at the salt until it basically becomes table salt, and you use it for preserving meat or seasoning food, or you basically go into salt mines and dig it out of the ground and work in very dangerous conditions where the mine could like collapse and you would die. And so they worked in these very painful and very labor-intensive industries in Mesopotamia. Around 869 CE, slave Ali bin Muhammad mounts a revolt of 15,000 slaves. They actually capture Basra, and it's later crushed by the Abbasids. I'd like you to think back to what other slave revolt that we've talked about ended in a very negative way as well. If you were thinking of the Spartacus slave revolt, then you'd be right. Next, we get African religion. Great diversity of religious beliefs. It's innumerable, the number of religions that we could probably start to talk about and what people believed pre-introduction of monotheistic religions from the Middle East. There was a common element, however, that there was a single male creator god. Lesser deities were associated with natural phenomena like wind or hurricanes or thunderstorms or whatever. And they believed in ancestor worship. They had diviners. They had religious specialists who were principally men, and these diviners could do a number of things. They were oracle reading. They could take chicken bones and roll them on the ground, and depending on how these chicken bones, when you say these magic words and they fall, could create some messages for what the people were supposed to do next or what the future holds. They could cast spells on people where they would maybe kill a chicken and take the blood, say some magic words, and curse somebody, or they could use the spells to heal people. They also had a number of other rituals that either helped or hurt, or they believed helped or hurt people in the real world. There was a limited emphasis on theology or the study of God. It was just kind of assumed there's a God up there, he's doing stuff, and we can kind of get him to be happy if we do certain rituals or we interact with him in certain ways, like throwing those chicken bones, or he really doesn't care about us. So they didn't really focus that much on the study of God, which is what theology means. Morality and the balance of nature was important. There were good and bad actions that people needed to follow. There was a positive and a negative event, and the outcome of which people needed to be aware of and make sure that they didn't harm one another or steal from one another or do anything negative to one another. There was also a balance to nature that they believed that for cutting down trees, you need to plant trees. For every time you kill an animal, you need to say a blessing for killing that animal, believing that there was a kind of tit for tat or yin and yang or balanced style to everything within nature. Early Christianity in North Africa. In the first century, it's popular in Egypt and North Africa. It's initially weak in sub-Saharan Africa because of the non-introduction of camels. The Christian kingdom of Aksum in the 4th century CE is around the area of Ethiopia. If you are a Catholic or a Protestant, you probably are familiar with the story of in the book of Acts, where one of the apostles, after being given the Great Commission by Jesus to go out and tell everybody about the good news of what Jesus has come to do, is kind of on the road one day, and he comes across an Ethiopian eunuch. And this Ethiopian eunuch is seen as the founder of Christianity in Ethiopia, as he brings back the message of Jesus to Africa. These merchants and kings then convert back into the 4th century now. The Bible is translated into Ethiopian, something that was very rare for the time. During this time, Christianity was heavily regulated by the people, specifically in the Western and Eastern Orthodox Church. They believed that the Bible was the words of God, but not to the extent that Islam would believe that Arabic was the only true version of God's word, and any translation would be a summary of what God was talking about. But during this time, this translation into the dialect of the people is something that is very rare for the world. The people of Ethiopia could actually understand what the Bible had in it, and also some of the things that Jesus said from the original text, but in its own language. It was isolated during the Islamic period, and there was a renaissance during the 12th century CE, and then they have massive churches carved out of solid rock. What they would actually do is find a rock somewhere on a hillside, and then they would have people slowly carve into the rock, and they would carve down into the rock, creating these like pits that could be a number of stories deep, and within that pit would be a tower with windows and elaborate porticos and all these different doorways that people could go into, and these solid rock churches to this day are still used by many within North Africa for worship in Christian practice. Ethiopian Christianity. Isolation from other Christian areas until the 16th century, so it kind of develops independently. It has a strong African influence, a connection to the spirit world, and amulets. So, as we've talked about in the past with Christianity, there's a lot of back and forth between the people in Rome and the people in Constantinople and the people in Russia and the people in Alexandria, Egypt, who are debating what it means to be a Christian, debating what it means to follow Jesus, to practice the sacraments, to how you're supposed to just do Christianity. Well, because Ethiopian Christianity is all the way in Africa and most of the Europeans are kind of obsessed with themselves, Christianity kind of develops in Ethiopia in a very unique way. It becomes very African in its form of religion. It focuses heavily on a spirit world or a spiritual world. This is not a heaven, but more understanding that the world has spirits to it, and that when we die, we will go to a spirit world, or we are all spirits within the world. They also believe in amulets or protector symbols that you wear on your body. Think of like how some people wear crosses or crucifix on their body on a necklace. They, as Catholics who wear crucifix, don't believe necessarily that crucifix will protect them from bad things like getting hit by a bus. But amulets, however, are little crosses or little symbols that people wear on their body that are supposedly supposed to keep evil spirits away, supposed to keep negative things from happening to you as you have them near you. So we made it all the way through Africa. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Number 1, explain the connections between agriculture and population growth in post-classical sub-Saharan Africa. There's only a couple things that happened, and we talked about how as calories increase, population goes up. Identify key features of post-classical African political organization. There are some organizing principles you can cling on to, even though it's kind of a mismatch. Number 3, explain the links between TransSaharan trade and the formation of West African Islamic states. That one's pretty easy. Number 4, explain the role of East African Islamic states in the Indian Ocean trade. Also easy. Number 5, outline the formation of social classes in post-classical Africa. Whole slide on that one. 6, identify key features of post-classical African religion. Just talked about that. And number 7, discuss the arrival of Christianity and Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. And here's your writing assignment. Write a short response, 5 to 8 sentences to the following questions. Use specifics and also textbook and be prepared to discuss them in class. Number 1, why do you think we have so few names to associate with sub-Saharan African history in this period? Interesting, huh? That we only talked about really 2 people, and we kind of talked in a general sense about everything else. How did the nature of the societies contribute to this phenomenon? How did their cultural traditions contribute? Interesting. Number 2, list and explain at least 5 reasons why Islam became such a prevalent religion in sub-Saharan Africa in this period. Use examples to justify each point. There's a number of those in the book. Number 3, compare and contrast the development of the Swahili city-states with West African empires in the years from the 11th to the 15th century. Ooh, that's so good. Once you know that, you're going to be able to knock this out of the park. As always, it has been great talking to you. It is time to bust open that book. Make sure you do those writing assignments. I'm sure those will help you out understand this chapter a lot better. I'll see you a bit later. Thanks. Bye.
What we do here is go back.
Loud.